Lecture 9, December 13, 1960. Ladies and gentlemen, in our last session I had begun to say something about that basic structure of fundamental ontology which, along with its general method, seems to me to justify the critical approach we need to adopt in relation to it. I am referring to that aspect which I provisionally described as the ontologization of the ontic. And this structure, as I pointed out, permeates the whole of Heidegger's philosophy and that of his followers. The trick, as it were, of this entire philosophy basically operates as follows. We are confronted with an opposition between the concept and the non-conceptual dimension which every concept tries to grasp. But insofar as I now form a concept of the non-conceptual that is subsumed by this concept in a certain sense itself becomes something conceptual. In other words, if I grasp all manifold beings together, which is what happens when, to use Greek terminology, the things that exist are gathered under the expression tau nu tau alpha, ta onta, then this non-conceptual and material dimension, heterogeneous to thought, is itself subjected to conceptuality. And this moment, through which the non-conceptual is subjected to the conceptual, and with it the universal expressions employed to capture the non-conceptual, are now ontologized, that is to say, are themselves elevated to structures of being. The transition consists precisely in this, since every being, everything non-conceptual, is mediated, as we would put it, or is referred to some concept, the domain of beings, or of what is at the same time supposed to be more than what it is, more than the beings themselves, is supposed to be ontological, as Heidegger puts it. Now, when I speak of a trick here, I beg you not to misunderstand me, as if I were thereby casting suspicion upon the subjective bona fides of the thinker Heidegger or that of his followers. That is very far from what I mean. What is more, I regard the particular character of private individuals as irrelevant as far as the critical reflections I am offering are concerned. For I consider the existentialist thesis that any form of thinking should be measured against the one who thinks it to be extraordinarily questionable in itself. And, apart from that, I think I have already indicated in these lectures that the problematic aspects of Heidegger's philosophy which I have pointed out do not arise on account of subjective insufficiencies of any kind. On the contrary, such errors of thought are, if I may put it very strongly, aporetic in character. In other words, they are inevitably brought about by the way this form of thought possesses and pursues a quite specific intention, deliberately undertakes to express a specific kind of experience, or however you wish to describe it. But in the very attempt to realize this intention comes up against certain internal substantive problems, which lead to the sort of maneuvers we have described if the original intention is to be maintained. Now I believe that it would simply be dishonest of me if I refused to admit that this very aspect which I have criticized and held against Heidegger at this point is also to be found, strangely enough, in that thinker who I myself would say, in the words of Tristan or rather Isolde, four terrible poisons hold a counterpoison '1, namely Hegel. And this applies, also strangely enough, at a point which is remarkably analogous to the problematic we are discussing right now. Of course, I cannot assume any real familiarity with Hegel here. But for those of you who have studied some Hegel I would just say that I am thinking of the transition from essence, or, more precisely, from ground, to existence in the second book of the Science of Logic, where existence is also resolved into pure thought and that existence itself is taken to be conceptually mediated as such. To this may already allow you to glimpse a certain profound affinity between Heidegger's philosophy and idealism, something which Heidegger himself also occasionally points out, at least in contrast to materialism. Just as idealism must try and resolve everything into consciousness, so Heidegger too must try and resolve everything into being. And being here, as this pure and absolute objectivity, is precisely nothing other than a subjectivity that is concealed from itself, that is held over itself, in other words, pure thought. And in both cases, in absolute idealism, or German idealism generally, and in the Heideggerian philosophy of being, the transition from absolute thought or pure being to the domain of beings leads to endless difficulties, which can only seemingly be mastered by mobilizing the kind of approach we have indicated. And this certainly explains why even the most significant philosophical conceptions, and here I am really thinking of those of Hegel in particular, in their specific execution are saturated with fallacies and sophisms. In Hegel's case, I believe, this is often directly connected with the fact that these conceptions are ultimately more programmatic in character, that the conception of what he has seen and what he wants to show goes beyond any intellectual procedures that he was actually able to develop and deploy in order to demonstrate this. And that is why these strangely sophistical leaps sometimes find their way into the text as a sort of substitute in this regard, something which is a constant source of irritation for those who wish to engage directly with Hegel's logic in particular, even in the most sympathetic spirit. With Heidegger the situation is rather different. What we find at these points in Heidegger is not so much a desperate attempt to capture something merely conceived in thought as an attempt, as I hope I have shown, to present something that cannot be thought at all or again, and this amounts to the same thing, to present thoughts to which nothing effectively corresponds, as if they could indeed claim a kind of self-evidence in the realm of thought. But, as we have said, these are all developments which certainly belong to the objective problematic of this philosophy, if not of philosophy in general. And you will have completely misunderstood these lectures if you just go back home and report, well, there you have it, Adorno has told us that Heidegger is a charlatan. I no more actually claim such a thing than Nietzsche actually claimed that Wagner was a charlatan. For insight into the objective untruth, into the objective aporias of specific cultural and intellectual forms, is something that cannot be reduced to some admittedly fallible and contingent subjectivity. And you can believe me that thinkers and philosophers are generally far too vain to let themselves be accused of deliberate lies when they must be fully convinced that more or less intelligent people will one day come to think the same as they do. And now that I have presented this thesis, this subreption or trick, as I have called it, in very general terms, I certainly need to substantiate this with reference to being and time, which in the final analysis is the most influential text of Heidegger's, and one which he himself has never effectively revoked. I now have to show what I have claimed through detailed interpretation of specific passages. And I would just like to say in advance that this tendency to ontologize the ontic relates not only to the highest category of all, namely being, but also specifically and in precisely the same way to the realm which is emphasized more than any other by the philosophy of being. I am talking about the sphere of history which in fundamental ontology is immediately sublimated into the Befindlichkeit, or state of mind, that belongs to Dasein, in other words, into Gestlichkeit, or historicality and indeed in such a way that concrete history, and the wholly concrete distress and problematic of history with it, actually falls through the gaps in this concept of historicality and is thus repudiated as something unworthy of philosophy. 3. In the form which it assumes in Heidegger, this ontologization of what is not ontological refers in the first instance to the existence of Dasein. This is the point, at least with respect to the early work Being and Time, where fundamental ontology and the philosophy of being connects with what you would perhaps call existentialism, which ultimately goes back to Kierkegaard and his doctrine that existing subjectivity is truth. The transformation that has taken place in Heidegger's thought, and I do not wish to give you the impression that I would necessarily hold the Heidegger of today to views that he no longer endorses, involves a certain change of emphasis. For the analysis of Dasein, and to make things easier to grasp here, I would suggest that you understand Dasein simply as subjectivity in an extremely broad sense of the word, is already essentially taken in Being and Time as the key or appropriate mode of access to the domain of being. The construction that I describe as the ontologization of the ontic serves precisely to facilitate this transition. In other words, Dasein is meant to be the key to being because existing subjectivity is the place in being, as it were, where the being that exists becomes aware of itself as being. Existence or Dasein or subject thus constitutes the place where ontology enters into subjectivity or subjectivity enters into ontology, a construction which indeed is hardly alien to the history of philosophy. Already in Schopenhauer, for example, the theory of motivation as one form of the principle of sufficient reason, which initially relates specifically to the world of representation, to the world of appearances, is at the same time the little window through which the absolute, namely the will, peers into the realm of representation. 4. In other words, this is the place where representation is mediated in relation to will, where beings, as Heidegger would say, are mediated in relation to being. I should just try and clarify the historical context of the change in Heidegger's thought which has taken place here, the philosophical intention which was in fact already emphatically announced in Being and Time, namely the idea that the analysis of Dasein or of existence was only supposed to open up the way to being as such, has only become all the more obvious and pronounced in his later writings. It is equally evident that, in order to avoid the conflation of his own analysis of being with the philosophy of existence in the narrower sense associated with Kierkegaard or Jaspers, 5. He has effectively moved further and further away from his earlier recourse to Dasein. Yet we are still justified in appealing to this analysis of Dasein as the psi epsilon delta omicron sigma, pseudos, which I am talking about, since the intention behind the analysis of Dasein in no way involves the reduction of truth to human existence, given that the analysis of human existence itself is only supposed to open up some kind of access to the problematic of being as such. Now I have made these preliminary observations. 6. I would like to read you the decisive, or some of the decisive, and prototypical passages from Being and Time. Thus in the 6th edition of 1949 you will find one of these passages on page 12. I would ask you to listen very carefully here, for we are dealing with some fairly difficult issues which you really need to grasp if you are to understand what I hope to get over to you, and which you will be able to understand properly only if you pay the same attention to the precise wording, which Heidegger himself quite rightly recommends us to do in relation to other philosophers. Thus he writes, Dasein is a being that does not simply occur amongst other beings. I have already said that you should translate the term Dasein in terms of the subject, in terms of man, not indeed in any particularly individual sense, but in the sense of the human essence, if you wish to get a preliminary understanding of what Dasein means in this connection. Rather, it is ontically distinguished, i.e. as a specific being, by the fact that, in its being, this being, i.e. Dasein, the specifically individual and existing being, is concerned about its very being. This is the decisive claim. You should try and translate it directly into what it is supposed to capture, namely what really distinguishes the human being and its consciousness amongst other beings that are known to us from all these other beings, and human consciousness, the actual consciousness of human beings, is indeed also a piece of world, as Husserl would say, is also in the first instance a being. And this is what philosophy in earlier periods would simply have described, if not as consciousness, then certainly as self-consciousness, an expression that Heidegger avoids only in order to confer a semblance of absolute originality upon reflections that are actually already encountered in the philosophical tradition. Perhaps I may just add here that this is something where the strategy of Heidegger's philosophy shows a certain fatal convergence with the current state of consciousness in general. In other words, this form of thinking, with all its related aspects, actually stands right within the tradition of philosophy, though God knows this is hardly something I would hold against it. There is no problem in this thinking, just as it is quite difficult to discover what are called really new problems in philosophy generally, that would not be directly related to the inherited problems of philosophy in quite manifest and usually extremely tangible fashion. But since this philosophy claims to be one of radical questioning and of absolute originality, these historically mediated problems always also appear as if they were being asked for the very first time, as if entirely new ground were being broken. And this effect is encouraged above all by the nomenclature which is deployed and the way it specifically avoids terms such as subjectivity or consciousness or self-consciousness. But in our own time philosophy is no longer a kind of ether which permeates the whole of cultural and intellectual life, as it did in the age of German idealism, and has now become such a specialist and professionalized subject that it holds very little interest for many people. As a result, we can no longer really expect any significant knowledge of the historical continuity of philosophical thought, and this increases the chance of immeasurably overestimating the claim such thinking makes, through its particular linguistic formulation, to genuine originality, to an ability to think what has never been thought before. But this claim gets taken à la lettre. And it is this aspect which accounts in part for the quasi-religious relationship which so many people adopt in relation to Heidegger. We can say, therefore, that the fascination which is exerted by this thinking is, to a certain degree, a product of ignorance. And I believe that when, in God's name, we really get to know the tradition, and therefore once we realize the continuity which connects these allegedly primordial experiences with what is indeed historical, much of this fascination will dissolve, unless, of course, we desire this fascination and anxiously cling to it as a possession we would not lose. Now when Heidegger says so pompously that this particular being, namely Dasein, in other words, the human being in general or in its essence, is concerned in its being about this very being, this initially means nothing more than that human beings think or reflect about themselves, that they ask themselves questions such as, what am I ultimately? How did I come into the world? What did I come into the world for? What is the meaning of my existence as such? The comprehensive form or general horizon of all such questions which arise through self-reflection, through self-consciousness, and which are actually limited, as far as we know, to human beings, is formulated here as the claim that this being in its being is concerned about its very being. You must try and make very clear to yourselves precisely what being means in the situation which is captured here, and which is indeed quite real, in this situation where, as human beings, we do think about questions such as, what is it to be human? What am I ultimately? Why am I in the world at all? I think I have already indicated my view on this. This concern, this being concerning about something, as it is understood here, actually means that what this being is concerned about is what this being is. In other words, the human being wants to know what it ultimately is. But the concept of the is here is at first completely ambiguous, or completely vague, and it certainly does not already imply the idea that, when we think about what Fichte still calls the vocation of man, 7 we must think about the being of man in distinction from Dasein, as that which is particular and individuated in space and time. But the substantivized verb to which the actual verbal form belongs is none other than sein, or being. Yet being in Heidegger's philosophy is of course an eminently latent expression. For being is precisely that which precedes both any particular being and any conceptual universality, as I hope I showed you when I explicated the concept in some detail in the last few lectures. The subreption or illegitimate move that is involved in this decisive claim of Heidegger's can be described as follows. Since this sign is also the infinitive of is, yet on the other hand is identical with the hypostasized metaphysical entity that Heidegger calls being, it now appears as if the question about what man ultimately is, that the traditional question from the history of philosophy about the essence and vocation of man, is presented as if man qua man is characterized by the specific way in which he relates to that entity, if I may put it that way, that bears the name being in Heidegger's philosophy. And this quite minimal ambiguity, for the detection of which we require the literally microscopic linguistic analysis that I have just employed, then has tremendous consequences for the entire approach which is adopted by this philosophy. I have not pursued this point simply for pedantic reasons, I beg you to believe me here, and certainly not for the sake of scoring points against Heidegger for his use of language, but solely to show you precisely how this leads to what I have called the ontologization of the ontic. The text continues as follows, thus it is constitutive of the being of Dasein - the entire separation of Dasein, being, and beings is already presupposed here - to have, in its very being, a relation of being to this being, in seinem Sein zu diesem Sein einstens verhaltenes hat. In terms of the history of philosophy I would just point out here that this passage, as it stands, is effectively alone, a variation, a duplication of a particular passage in Kierkegaard. You can all easily look it up, and I have no wish to explore it philologically here. You will find it in the opening pages of Sickness unto Death, 8, where existence itself is grasped as a relation which the human being has to itself, as a kind of internal reflection, but with the difference that Kierkegaard has here taken over from Hegel certain concepts such as existence, being, and so on, whatever they may be, which involve immeasurably complex presuppositions of their own. 9. Whereas Heidegger presents the idea of the twofold character of Dasein as at once being and a being, as some kind of primordial relationship. In other words, Dasein is supposed to be that specific being which, through its mere existence, possesses a relationship to that absolute which is known in Heidegger's philosophy as being. And here you can also readily see that the famous remark from the letter on humanism, which I have mentioned once or twice before, 10, that being lights up as it were in man, is actually already implicit in the far less provocative formulations of being and time. As Heidegger continues, and this in turn means that Dasein understands itself in its being, in seinem Sein, in some way and with some degree of explicitness. And there you have it. It is already evident that what really constitutes man as man, for Heidegger, what constitutes Dasein as Dasein, is precisely that it is a particular being that stands in a relationship to that ipsium which is singled out by the honorific name of being in this ontological philosophy. He goes on, it is proper to this being that it is disclosed to itself with and through its being. In other words, according to Heidegger, it is the distinctive characteristic of man that Dasein, as a being, possesses the quality, the admittedly rather enigmatic quality, of being open to that ipsium, namely being which is itself neither a concept nor a being. What he calls the understanding of being, Sintverstandnis, stands in contrast to the forgetfulness of being and must therefore be understood in the emphatic sense which I have explained in the last few sessions. Thus he goes on, understanding of being is itself a determination of being of Dasein. The ontic distinction of Dasein lies in the fact that it is ontological. The transition here consists specifically in the fact that something determinately ontic, namely man, by virtue of possessing self-consciousness, is itself ontological at the same time. In other words, it is something like the consciousness of being as such. Something determinately ontic, on account of its own conscious awareness, thereby immediately becomes the bearer of ontology, or, as we might also put it, is utterly ontologized. At a slightly later point of the text, a page or so further on, Heidegger formulates this as follows: Dasein accordingly takes priority in several ways over all other beings. The first priority is an ontic one. This being is defined in its being by existence. Now that is effectively a tautology. It means that the particular being that we call man, that we are as existing human beings, as Dasein, is just what an existing human being is ex definition. Thus the predicate hardly adds anything new to the subject. 11 But now comes the decisive claim, and it is one to which I effectively appeal as a literal confirmation of my thesis about the ontologization of the ontic. The second priority is an ontological one, on the basis of its determination as existence. Dasein is in itself ontological. In other words, by reference to a universal determination of Dasein, such as the possession of self-consciousness, it follows that Dasein is itself ontological. This is the special and exemplary case of that far more universal claim that we could formulate as follows: every being, all that exists, precisely by virtue of existing, is itself subject to universality, to the category of existence, so that in its being it has existence as its ground, as Heidegger would say, and that within it which is precisely not being, namely its character as a being, The particular qualification of its being is itself specifically supposed to be a particular ontological characteristic, and thus again something ontological. And here I would just like to draw your attention to another formulation. For you can also recognize the hypostasis involved and see right here, in the following remarks of Heidegger, how existence is indeed identified with being, and thus how the ontic, the actually existent, is identified with the ontological. He writes, "We shall call the very being to which Dasein can relate in one way or another, and somehow always does relate, existence." I should add that this concept of existence is defined by Heidegger as its own possibility to be or not to be itself, which confirms a thesis which I hope I shall be able to substantiate in detail, namely that the concept of existing which plays such a significant role in existential philosophy ends up with the mere self-identity of what exists. In other words, of all the imperatives which philosophy, as long as it still possessed a meaning, addressed to those who genuinely engaged with it, one alone has finally emerged almost as parody: be who you are. Since, in the world in which we live, human beings cannot be anything more than what they are, namely what they have been condemned to be by the way in which life is currently arranged, they are now encouraged with tremendous palaver and truly vatic gestures to take up what is already unavoidably imposed on them and freely identify with it. Now they can be themselves, because we cannot actually be anything other than what we are condemned to be. This is a thesis which in some of the ideas of Jean-Paul Sartre has actually, in spite of himself, been taken ad absurdum in a rather parodic manner. You will hardly have failed to notice that Heidegger appeals to this structure, that a particular being is itself ontological as the defining and distinctive feature for the doctrine of Dasein. But it is necessary to justify in more detail the claim that this subreption actually provides the schema for this thinking as a whole. In other words, to show how this is not merely limited to Dasein, to the fact of self-consciousness, but that we also constantly find the same move at work in relation to attunement, Befindlichkeit, and all the other theoretical analyses. Here too, of course, there is a precedent in the philosophical tradition, and especially, as with most of Heidegger, in the form in which this tradition was directly passed on to him by his teacher Husserl. For in Husserl every particular discipline, including the factual sciences which are concerned with specific beings, such as psychology, is coordinated with a so-called didactic discipline, namely a pure science concerned with the fundamental structures of the psyche, which is ultimately distinguished from the former discipline only because it does not instruct us directly about the actual spatio-temporal existence of the relevant objects but brackets the latter by means of the episch. These Husserlian ontologies which correspond to the material disciplines relate to the relevant empirical disciplines in much the same way that, on Aristotle's view of things, the Platonic ideas relate to the actual things in the world. In other words, they ultimately simply repeat the latter. And this repetition, where the pure essences repeat or duplicate what actual beings are, but precisely without the moment of individuation, already of course effectively implies that these beings themselves ought to be one with their corresponding ideas, or, to put this in Heidegger's terms, that the ontic ought to be ontological. If we just abandon the methodological scientific separation between the material disciplines and ontology, as it were, then, if we are concerned solely with essences, we already find that a discipline such as psychology, taken as a mere doctrine of essence, is at once both ontic and ontological. The ontic, namely the elements of psychology which are confirmed in the field of experience, then becomes the ontological as an eidetic science, as a pure doctrine of the psyche, as ideal possibility. Heidegger's doctrine of the universal ontological character of the ontic simply draws the required conclusion from this tension within Husserl's phenomenology. And here, incidentally, Heidegger's thought also has the advantage of dispensing with that burdensome duplication, that suspicious parallelism between the eidetic disciplines and the factual sciences. For in this way he directly ascribes ontological dignity only to the highest ontic concepts, the highest universals of the ontic realm, whereas with Husserl we can naturally always ask the same question that Aristotle asked in relation to Plato, that is all very well, but if, apart from this purely formal index, your eidetic disciplines and factual sciences are the same after all, what is actually the point of this entire separation in the first place? And what is the point of the enormous effort expended in order to attain something such as pure phenomenology? But the passage which I have just read out and interpreted for you also implies something else, and perhaps I should say at least a few words about this here. For this interpretation of the subject, of Dasein, as that which possesses the ontic priority of being ontological, involves a remarkable turn of thought. And here you can surely still recognize the legacy of that earlier idealism which regards the self-consciousness of man, and the analysis of mind or spirit, as the key for the understanding of everything, the key for the understanding of being. But the turn of thought here, and it is presumably this which explains the considerable influence of Heidegger's philosophy, consists in this: the realm of being or objectivity, or however we may describe it for the moment, is not constituted from the perspective of the subject, since the question concerning the subject is subordinated to the question concerning being. And this is abundantly clear from everything I have told you about the superiority or the priority of being in his philosophy. And when he defines Dasein precisely as that being which also enjoys the particular advantage of being open to being and receptive to being, then you find that this immediately implies, in contrast to the critical philosophy, that it is not being, namely the concept of being, which is brought back to subjectivity in a critical manner, but, rather, subjectivity, which almost becomes, to recall the terms I have used before, 12 the stage or scene of being. But that too has a tradition behind it and has not just fallen straight from the heavens. I do not know whether any of you heard the inaugural lecture which Herr Liebrux 13 delivered recently. For he showed with reference to one of the most crucial passages in Kant, namely the deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding, that this deduction which is presented in such emphatically subjective terms is nonetheless always governed by an objective interest. I would just add to this that Kant's basic interest, as we can see above all from a passage in the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, a passage which I shall read out to you in one of the coming lectures 14, is actually always an objective interest. What sets Kant apart from empiricism is that he was not really interested in studying the mechanisms of thought or consciousness as such, although he does do this. Rather, he was interested in studying and understanding how, through these processes, something like objective cognition, validity and objectivity are possible at all. And to this extent, that aspect of objectivity, which I have spoken to you about in Heidegger, or the turn through which subjectivity becomes a stage or scene, is also prefigured in Kant, albeit with a crucial difference. Lecture 10.